Welcome back, you night owls. Today we walk into the lion's den of the Tudor court to examine a ghost who defies all political logic. In a reign defined by the executioner's axe, where queens, cardinals, and royal cousins were shortened by a head for the slightest misstep, one man committed the ultimate high treason and lived to die in his own bed. He was a man of relatively low birth who rose to become a duke, a warrior who married the king's own sister without permission, and a courtier who stood so close to the fire of Henry's tyranny that he should have been burned alive. We are talking about Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. The question that haunts the archives is this: was he Henry's only true friend, a lucky survivor, or something far more calculating, a man who understood the psychology of power better than anyone else at court? Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. To understand the paradox of Charles Brandon, we must look past the romanticized paintings of jousting tournaments and peer into the terrified scribbles of foreign ambassadors. Diplomatic dispatches from the era often struggle to define him. To the Venetian envoys, he was a second king, a man who physically resembled Henry's so closely in stature and charisma that they were often mistaken for one another in the chaos of the tilt yard. But this physical mirroring hides a darker psychological game. History keeps its secrets, but the primary sources leave us a trail of breadcrumbs suggesting that Brandon wasn't just a drinking companion. He was a necessary alter ego for a narcissistic monarch. We have to ask, what if almost everything we think we know about their brotherhood is wrong? While the official records show a loyal servant, the timeline of his life reveals a man who navigated scandal, bigamy, and lethal court factions with a surgeon's precision. Over this series, we will dissect the legal loopholes he exploited and the silence he maintained while others fell. We are about to unravel the story of the only man who could look Henry's in the eye and survive the reflection. To understand the anomaly of Charles Brandon, we must first stand in the mud of Leicestershire on August 22, 1485. This is the Battle of Bosworth Field, the bloody birth of the Tudor dynasty. But amidst the clatter of armor and the desperate maneuvers of cavalry, one specific death set the trajectory for the next 60 years of English history. That death belonged to William Brandon, Charles's father. William was Henry Tudor's standard-bearer. In the medieval chaos of war, this was not merely a ceremonial role, it was a target painted on one's back. He held the red dragon of Cadwallader aloft, the psychological anchor for the rebel army. According to the chronicler Polydore Virgil, King Richard III, realizing the battle was slipping away, launched a desperate, suicidal cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. But standing between the desperate king and the future monarch was William Brandon. Virgil's account is chillingly specific. He writes that Richard, in his fury, personally overthrew William Brandon, the standard-bearer, and made way to invade Henry. In that split second, William Brandon was cut down by the last Plantagenet king. He died instantly, his blood soaking into the marsh, buying Henry Tudor the precious seconds he needed to survive and eventually win the crown. Here lies the root of the Brandon enigma. Charles was barely a toddler when his father was slain to save the king. The Tudors, a family obsessed with loyalty and divine providence, understood this as blood debt. When Henry VII looked at the orphan Charles, he didn't just see a ward of the court. He saw the ghost of the man who died so the Tudors could rule. Historians often debate why Charles Brandon was later allowed to get away with treasonous acts that would have sent other men to the block. The answer likely lies here, in the soil of Bosworth. The Brandons had already paid the ultimate price for the Tudors. This was not merely friendship, it was an inherited obligation, a bond forged in the violence of regime change that protected Charles long before he ever picked up a lance. History often overlooks the quiet years, focusing instead on the battles and the beheadings, but to understand how Charles Brandon survived a lifetime of treason, we must look at the nursery. Following the death of William Brandon at Bosworth, King Henry VII, a man not known for his warmth, but rigid in his honor, paid his blood debt. He didn't just give the orphan Charles a stipend, he brought him into the royal household. We don't have personal diaries from a 5-year-old Brandon, but the silence of the archives is broken by the dry, dusty pages of the Lord Chamberlain's accounts. If we read between the lines of these ledgers, amidst payments for velvet doublets, hose, and Latin tutors, a fascinating picture emerges. Charles wasn't just a ward, he was placed alongside the king's second son, Henry, the Duke of York. While Prince Arthur was being groomed in solitary majesty to be king, the future Henrys and Charles Brandon were allowed a rougher, more tangible education. They were the spare heirs, the boys in the shadows. Modern psychology suggests this period is the key to the entire Brandon paradox. They shared tutors, they shared food, and crucially, they shared a physical rivalry. Both grew up to be physically imposing men, over 6 feet tall, athletic, and obsessed with martial skill. We can imagine the wrestling matches on the lawns of Eltham Palace, where the lines between prince and subject blurred into the sweat of childhood competition. Some historians whisper that this is where Brandon learned his most valuable lesson: how to be the prince's equal without ever making him feel inferior. He became the mirror Henry wanted to look into, strong, loyal, and brave, but a mirror that never outshone the subject. The accounts show us that they were dressed similarly, educated similarly, and molded by the same Renaissance ideals. By the time Henry ascended the throne, Charles Brandon wasn't just a courtier. In the king's mind, he was the only brother who had actually lived alongside him, unlike the distant, sickly Arthur. This shared boyhood created a psychological fortress around Brandon that no amount of later scandal could fully breach. To understand the meteoric rise of Charles Brandon, we must step away from the hushed whispers of the council chamber and enter the thundering spectacle of the tilt-yard. In the early 16th century, the joust was far more than a sport. It was high political theater, the primary engine of Tudor propaganda designed to project the virility and invincible power of the new dynasty. It was here, amidst the shattering of lances and the roar of the crowd, that Brandon found his true vocation. Contemporary chroniclers and heralds frequently noted the uncanny physical resemblance between the king and his favorite. Both men were giants for their age, standing well over 6 feet tall, sharing the same reddish-gold coloring and boundless athletic aggression. When they rode out onto the field, often clad in matching armor of gilded steel or cloth of gold, they appeared not as sovereign and subject, but as a mythical duality, Castor and Pollux brought to life. We see this dynamic preserved in the famous Westminster Tournament Roll of 1511, a magnificent visual record where the pageantry often blurs the distinction between the king and his aides. Brandon understood the unspoken script of these events perfectly. He served as the king's alter ego, the only man in England capable of withstanding Henry's physical force, yet politically astute enough to ensure the king always shone as the ultimate hero. This raises a fascinating psychological question that historians still debate. Did Brandon consciously mold himself into Henry's reflection to secure his position? The Venetian ambassadors, always sharp observers of these court dynamics, frequently remarked in their dispatches on how Brandon governed the king's pastimes with an almost brotherly familiarity. By making himself the indispensable partner in Henry's favorite obsession, Brandon transformed his own body into a political asset. He was performing a dangerous dance of intimacy, proving to the court, and to Henry himself, that he was the only man strong enough to stand beside the Tudor lion without being devoured. This brotherhood of the tilt forged a bond of sweat and adrenaline that no mere paper law could easily sever. If the tournament field was where Charles Brandon built his reputation as a hero, the ecclesiastical courts were where he nearly destroyed it as a scoundrel. We tend to view Brandon through the romantic lens of his later, treasonous marriage to Mary Tudor, but to understand the sheer audacity of that event, we must first dissect the first scandal, a tangled web involving Anne Brown and Margaret Mortimer that reads less like a courtly romance and more like a modern legal thriller. Under the strictures of pre-Reformation canon law, a contract, per verba de presenti, a present promise to marry, often followed by consummation, was as legally binding as a ceremony performed at the high altar. Historical records indicate Brandon had pledged himself to Anne Brown, a gentlewoman of impeccable lineage. Yet, in a move that reveals a ruthless streak of financial ambition, he abandoned this binding contract to marry the wealthy, older widow Margaret Mortimer. This was not a crime of passion, it was a crime of accounting. The Brandon estate was cash poor, and Mortimer offered immediate liquidity. However, the primary sources reveal a breathtaking cynicism in what followed. After securing Mortimer's dowry and liquidating a significant portion of her assets, Brandon suddenly discovered a prick of conscience. He petitioned to annul his marriage to Mortimer on the grounds of his previous binding contract with Brown, and, adding insult to injury, cited issues of consanguinity. He essentially argued that his marriage was illegal due to his own previous actions, utilizing his own infidelity as a legal loophole to escape a wife he had already exploited. The legal fallout was so severe that it haunted him for decades. We see this in the frantic legal maneuvering years later, requiring a papal bull from Clement VII in 1528 to retroactively validate his choices and ensure his children were not branded bastards. In my interpretation, this chapter of his life is crucial because it establishes a psychological baseline. Charles Brandon viewed the law not as an immutable wall, but as a door he could kick down if he possessed enough charm and the king's favor. This legal labyrinth was merely the dress rehearsal for the high-stakes treason he would commit in France years later. History is often written in blood, but in the case of Charles Brandon, his most dangerous battles were fought with ink. In this chapter, we enter the dusty, candlelit chambers of the ecclesiastical courts to examine the void contract that severed Brandon from the wealthy Margaret Mortimer. This was not a modern divorce. It was an annulment, a legal fiction declaring that the marriage had never existed in the eyes of God. The primary sources from the Archidiaconal Court of London reveal a man desperate to rewrite his own past. Brandon's legal team argued a dual defense. First, that he and Mortimer were related within the forbidden degrees of consanguinity, and second, that he had a prior binding pre-contract with Anne Brown. To the modern observer, this reads like a cynical exploitation of canon law loopholes. Yet we must look closer at the stakes. If the Mortimer marriage was valid, any children Brandon had with Anne Brown and later with the Queen of France would be legally illegitimate, stripped of rank and inheritance. This legal maneuver cast a lifelong shadow over his house. Decades later, in 1528, Brandon was still so paranoid about this void contract resurfacing that he petitioned Pope Clement VII for a papal bull to explicitly ratify the annulment once and for all. We'll never know for certain what transpired in Brandon's private conscience during these proceedings. Did he feel the weight of the woman he was erasing from his life? Or was this merely the cold calculation of a survivor? A darker theory suggests that this legal labyrinth was Brandon's training ground. It taught him that truth in Tudor England was malleable, provided one had the king's favor and a clever canon lawyer. The VIII contract was not just a domestic dispute. It was the moment Charles Brandon realized that to rise, he had to be willing to legally annihilate anyone standing in his way. The document he secured was a shield, but as his political enemies would later whisper, it was a shield made of parchment, easily pierced by the sharp tip of a rumor. History is often written by the victors, but the most honest accounts frequently come from the spies. In the early years of Henry's reign, the sharpest eyes at court belonged not to the English nobles, but to the foreign ambassadors, men like the Venetian envoys, whose dispatches back to the Doge read less like diplomatic reports and more like warning bells. While the English court was dazzled by Charles Brandon's jousting prowess and his easy charm, these diplomats saw something far more alarming: a dangerous upstart with his hand on the tiller of the state. To the Venetian ambassador, Brandon was a fascinating, terrifying anomaly. In their encoded letters, preserved today in the Venetian state archives, they described a man who, despite lacking royal blood, rode with the king, dressed like the king, and, most crucially, governed the king's will. They frequently referred to him as a second king, a phrase that carries a heavy, treasonous weight. In the rigid, hierarchical world of Tudor Europe, a man rising this high, this fast, wasn't a hero. He was a destabilizing agent, a glitch in the matrix of the great chain of being. We must ask ourselves a difficult question: what did these cynical diplomats see that the English court missed? They saw the Grand Esquire not just as a drinking buddy, but as a formidable gatekeeper. If you wanted Henry, you had to go through Brandon. This created a palpable anxiety in the courts of Europe. They feared that this unpolished soldier was isolating the young monarch, feeding his ego to secure his own position. It brings us to a darker theory regarding his character. Perhaps Brandon wasn't just the loyal friend we see in romanticized history, but a master manipulator whom foreign powers recognized as a threat long before the English nobility woke up to the danger. The ambassador's pens scratched out a portrait of a man who realized early on that, in a court of wolves, the safest place to stand was in the shadow of the lion, whispering into its ear. On February 1st, 1514, Henry's performed an act of political alchemy that left the ancient nobility reeling. In a ceremony dripping with pomp and latent tension, the king took Charles Brandon, a man whose grandfather was a mere squire, and elevated him to the rank of Duke of Suffolk. To the modern observer, this might seem like a simple promotion, but we must understand the sheer audacity of this move in the Tudor context. In 1514, a dukedom was not merely a title, it was a sacred designation almost exclusively reserved for those with royal blood. At that moment, there were only two other dukes in all of England, the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Buckingham. Both men traced their lineage back to the Plantagenets and viewed themselves as the natural pillars of the monarchy. Brandon, by contrast, traced his lineage to a modest family in East Anglia. By placing Brandon on their level, Henry wasn't just rewarding a friend, he was rewriting the rules of social hierarchy. The foreign ambassadors, those ever-watchful vultures of the court, immediately picked up on the seismic shift. Venetian envoys sent dispatches describing Brandon as a second king, noting that his influence was no longer just a rumor, it was now formalized in gold coronets and ermine robes. But why take the risk? Why anger powerful men like Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who reportedly viewed Brandon with undisguised contempt? While we cannot know Henry's internal monologue, I suspect the answer lies in the looming French negotiations. Henry was secretly plotting to marry his sister, Mary Tudor, to the aging Louis XII of France. To handle such delicate, high-stakes diplomacy, Henry could not send a mere viscount or a courtier. He needed a peer who could look the haughty French nobility in the eye without blinking. The title of Duke was likely a tool, diplomatic armor given to Brandon so he could survive the shark tank of the French court. Yet, in gifting him this title, Henry inadvertently placed a massive target on Brandon's back. As we close this chapter, Brandon stands at the pinnacle of his power, unaware that this very elevation has just raised the stakes for the dangerous game he is about to play in Paris. In October 1514, the machinery of the Tudor state did not march to war, but to a wedding, revealing the cold, transactional heart of dynastic politics. We find ourselves in Abbeville, France, witnessing the culmination of a treaty where Henry's essentially sold his 18-year-old sister, Mary Tudor, to the King of France to secure a temporary peace. To the casual observer, the scene was one of unparalleled splendor, tapestries of gold thread and banquets that lasted for days, but strip away the pageantry, and we see the brutal reality of the French pawn. Consider the jarring visual contrast at the altar. Mary was widely considered the most beautiful princess in Europe, vibrant and healthy. Beside her stood King Louis XII, a man of 52 who, by the harsh standards of 16th-century medicine, was essentially a geriatric case. Venetian ambassadors, often the most reliable gossip columnists of the age, wrote home with scathing honesty. They described the French king as feeble, suffering from severe gout, and possessing a pockmarked face that no amount of royal finery could hide. One observer noted that he seemed more fit for a sickbed than a bridal bed. For Charles Brandon, newly minted as the Duke of Suffolk, this spectacle must have been a complex psychological burden. While he was there ostensibly to participate in the celebratory justs, he was also watching a woman he had known since childhood being traded like livestock. We have to wonder, what was going through his mind? Was he merely a dutiful courtier, or was he already harboring the dangerous affection that would soon threaten his life? The records are silent on Brandon's internal monologue during the ceremony, but his actions in the weeks to follow suggest he was keenly aware of the precariousness of Mary's position. This marriage highlights the terrifying lack of agency held by Tudor women. Mary was a peace treaty in a silk dress. Yet, as we will see, she was perhaps the only pawn on the board who had already negotiated her own escape route. The ink was barely dry on the diplomatic parchments of 1514 when 18-year-old Mary Tudor faced the reality of her duty. She was to be the French Queen, a title purchased with her youth, traded to the 52-year-old King Louis XII. Venetian ambassadors, those meticulous chroniclers of court gossip, described Mary as a paradise, tall, fair, and vibrant, while painting Louis as a man ravaged by gout and age, a figure who appeared more like a grandfather than a groom. But amidst this transactional diplomacy, there was a private, steel-spine negotiation that history almost missed. We must turn to the primary sources, specifically the desperate letters Mary would later write to her brother, to reconstruct the scene. Before she boarded the ship at Dover, amidst the sensory overload of salt spray and snapping royal standards, Mary cornered Henry's. In these letters, she reminds the king of a verbal pact, a secret promise that seems almost anachronistic for a Tudor woman. She agreed to endure the marriage to Louis, to submit to the political alliance for the good of the realm, but on one non-negotiable condition, that should she survive her elderly husband, she would be free to marry for love the second time around. Did Henry take her seriously? It is a question that invites speculation. Perhaps, in his narcissism, he simply wished to placate a weeping sister to ensure the treaty held. Or perhaps, looking at the ailing French king, he calculated that Louis might linger for years, making the promise a problem for a distant future. We will never know for certain what was in Henry's mind, but we know what was in Mary's. She viewed this not as a surrender, but as a deferment of happiness. As she sailed toward the French coast, leaving the comfort of the English court for the unknown snake pit of Paris, she carried with her the king's word, a dangerous piece of currency in a world where royal promises were often as fluid as the tides. By placing Brandon on their level, Henry wasn't just rewarding a friend, he was rewriting the rules of social hierarchy. The foreign ambassadors, those ever-watchful vultures of the court, immediately picked up on the seismic shift. Venetian envoys sent dispatches describing Brandon as a second king, noting that his influence was no longer just a rumor, it was now formalized in gold coronets and ermine robes. But why take the risk? Why anger powerful men like Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who reportedly viewed Brandon with undisguised contempt? While we cannot know Henry's internal monologue, I suspect the answer lies in the looming French negotiations. Henry was secretly plotting to marry his sister, Mary Tudor, to the aging Louis XII of France. To handle such delicate, high-stakes diplomacy, Henry could not send a mere viscount or a courtier. He needed a peer who could look the haughty French nobility in the eye without blinking. The title of Duke was likely a tool, diplomatic armor given to Brandon so he could survive the Shark Tank of the French court. Yet, in gifting him this title, Henry inadvertently placed a massive target on Brandon's back. As we close this chapter, Brandon stands at the pinnacle of his power, unaware that this very elevation has just raised the stakes for the dangerous game he is about to play in Paris. In October 1514, the machinery of the Tudor state did not march to war, but to a wedding, revealing the cold, transactional heart of dynastic politics. We find ourselves in Abbeville, France, witnessing the culmination of a treaty where Henry's essentially sold his 18-year-old sister, Mary Tudor, to the King of France to secure a temporary peace. To the casual observer, the scene was one of unparalleled splendor, tapestries of gold thread and banquets that lasted for days, but strip away the pageantry, and we see the brutal reality of the French pawn. Consider the jarring visual contrast at the altar. Mary was widely considered the most beautiful princess in Europe, vibrant and healthy. Beside her stood King Louis XII, a man of 52 who, by the harsh standards of 16th-century medicine, was essentially a geriatric case. Venetian ambassadors, often the most reliable gossip columnists of the age, wrote home with scathing honesty. They described the French king as feeble, suffering from severe gout, and possessing a pockmarked face that no amount of royal finery could hide. One observer noted that he seemed more fit for a sickbed than a bridal bed. For Charles Brandon, newly minted as the Duke of Suffolk, this spectacle must have been a complex psychological burden. While he was there ostensibly to participate in the celebratory justs, he was also watching a woman he had known since childhood being traded like livestock. We have to wonder, what was going through his mind? Was he merely a dutiful courtier, or was he already harboring the dangerous affection that would soon threaten his life? The records are silent on Brandon's internal monologue during the ceremony, but his actions in the weeks to follow suggest he was keenly aware of the precariousness of Mary's position. This marriage highlights the terrifying lack of agency held by Tudor women. Mary was a peace treaty in a silk dress. Yet, as we will see, she was perhaps the only pawn on the board who had already negotiated her own escape route. The ink was barely dry on the diplomatic parchments of 1514 when 18-year-old Mary Tudor faced the reality of her duty. She was to be the French Queen, a title purchased with her youth, traded to the 52-year-old King Louis XII. Venetian ambassadors, those meticulous chroniclers of court gossip, described Mary as a paradise, tall, fair, and vibrant, while painting Louis as a man ravaged by gout and age, a figure who appeared more like a grandfather than a groom. But amidst this transactional diplomacy, there was a private, steel-spine negotiation that history almost missed. We must turn to the primary sources, specifically the desperate letters Mary would later write to her brother, to reconstruct the scene. Before she boarded the ship at Dover, amidst the sensory overload of salt spray and snapping royal standards, Mary cornered Henry's. In these letters, she reminds the king of a verbal pact, a secret promise that seems almost anachronistic for a Tudor woman. She agreed to endure the marriage to Louis, to submit to the political alliance for the good of the realm, but on one non-negotiable condition, that should she survive her elderly husband, she would be free to marry for love the second time around. Did Henry take her seriously? It is a question that invites speculation. Perhaps, in his narcissism, he simply wished to placate a weeping sister to ensure the treaty held. Or perhaps, looking at the ailing French king, he calculated that Louis might linger for years, making the promise a problem for a distant future. We will never know for certain what was in Henry's mind, but we know what was in Mary's. She viewed this not as a surrender, but as a deferment of happiness. As she sailed toward the French coast, leaving the comfort of the English court for the unknown snake pit of Paris, she carried with her the king's word, a dangerous piece of currency in a world where royal promises were often as fluid as the tides. In her confession, she admits to a frantic ultimatum. She told Brandon that if he did not marry her then and there, he would never have me. This was not a soft, candlelight seduction as often portrayed in fiction. This was a woman cornered by dynastic politics, wielding her only leverage, her lineage and her verbal pact with the king. We can imagine the sweat on Brandon's brow. He was staring at a cliff edge. To obey his king meant leaving Mary to be pawned off again. To obey Mary meant committing high treason, punishable by death. The English friars lurking in the background, likely spies for Wolsey, added to the paranoia of the moment. We will never know the exact words whispered in that chapel, but Mary's letters reveal a woman terrified of the extreme pain of another political marriage. She essentially hijacked Brandon's mission, transforming him from an ambassador into a co-conspirator. It forces us to ask, was Brandon the aggressive suitor of court gossip, or was he merely a man swept away by a terrified princess who refused to be sold a second time? The decision made in the shadows of Cluny would bind their fates and nearly cost them their heads. The candles flickered in the damp, private chapel of the Hotel de Cluny, illuminating a scene that was less a fairy tale and more a capital crime. In late February or early March 1515, amidst the shadows of Paris, Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor exchanged secret vows. We must strip away the romantic veneer to understand the terrifying reality. Under English law, marrying a princess of the royal blood without the monarch's express license was high treason, punishable by death. Yet, the primary sources suggest it was Mary, not Brandon, who forced the issue. In her later correspondence to Henry, she explicitly takes the blame, stating she constrained Brandon to marry her immediately or lose her forever. She understood that if she returned to England unmarried, she would simply be sold to the next highest bidder in the European marriage market. A darker theory circulates regarding Francis I. Why did he allow this secret ceremony? Contemporary whispers suggest Francis encouraged the match not out of benevolence, but calculation. By ensuring Mary married a mere English duke, Francis prevented her from marrying a Habsburg prince, which would have strengthened the alliance against France. Following the secret ceremony, the couple faced terrifying reality. They were legally married in the eyes of God, but traitors in the eyes of the king. The timeline here is critical. Had they attempted to hide the marriage, or had the Venetian ambassadors, who were notoriously efficient spies, reported the news to London before Brandon could confess, Henry's paranoia would have likely overridden his friendship. They had to confess immediately, throwing themselves on the king's mercy before the rumors could turn to poison. They would later undergo a public ceremony at Greenwich on May 13, 1515, after securing Henry's grudging consent, a formal acknowledgement that legitimized their union in English law. But in those early weeks in Paris, before Henry's permission arrived, every day was a gamble with the executioner's axe. As the ink dried on their confession letters, Brandon must have wondered if he was signing his own death warrant. The ink on the secret marriage contract in the Cluny Chapel was barely dry before the romantic haze lifted, replaced by the cold, hard reality of English law. In Chapter 15, we turn our gaze from the lovers in Paris to the frantic paper trail crossing the English Channel, focusing specifically on the intervention of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. If Charles Brandon was the heart of the king, Wolsey was his brain, and it was Wolsey who now held Brandon's life in his hands. We must look closely at the primary sources here, specifically the letters sent from Wolsey to Brandon in March 1515. The tone is not one of friendly advice, it is one of catastrophic urgency. Wolsey writes explicitly that Henry's was so struck with sorrow and fury upon hearing of the unauthorized marriage that the king was prepared to invoke the full penalty of the law. In one chilling dispatch, Wolsey warns Brandon that the council in London was calling for his head, arguing that he had presumed too much upon the king's favor. We can almost feel the sweat on the parchment as Brandon reads these warnings. He was not merely a courtier in trouble. He was a man who had technically kidnapped a royal princess and committed high treason. The correspondence reveals a terrified Brandon. His replies to Wolsey are stripped of all arrogance. He writes of his heaviness and sorrow, admitting that he had acted out of passion and the fear that the council would ship Mary off to yet another political marriage. But here, we must engage in a bit of historical speculation. Was Henry's rage genuine, or was it a performance? Some historians suggest that Henry may have secretly sanctioned the match but needed to feign outrage to satisfy the conservative faction of his court who despised Brandon as an upstart. Wolsey's role, therefore, was to choreograph the apology. He instructed Brandon not to justify his actions but to prostrate himself completely. The letters show us a man begging for his life, trading his dignity for survival, proving that while love may have been the motive, political maneuvering was the only means of salvation. The executioner's axe had been stayed, but the king's mercy came with a price tag that would haunt Charles Brandon to his grave. While Henry's had publicly forgiven the treasonous couple, privately he treated the marriage as a transaction that required balancing. The terms of their rehabilitation were set out in a brutal financial contract in May 1515. Henry demanded the repayment of Mary's dowry and the costs of her initial wedding to Louis XII, a staggering sum of £24,000, payable in annual installments of £1,000. To put this in perspective, this debt was essentially an insurmountable mortgage on Brandon's future. But the king went further. We must look at the inventory of what Mary was forced to surrender. She handed over the magnificent plate and jewels she had brought back from France, including the legendary Mirror of Naples diamond. There is a profound psychological dimension to this exchange. Henry was stripping his sister and his best friend of their independence. By burdening Brandon with a debt he could never realistically clear, Henry ensured that the Duke of Suffolk would never again have the autonomy to defy him. Historians often debate the nature of Henry's sudden leniency. Was it brotherly love, or was it the cold calculation of a monarch who realized a living, indebted duke was more useful than a dead one? The records show that for the rest of his life, Brandon's correspondence is littered with desperate attempts to manage his finances, leading him to pursue aggressive wardships and land grabs later in his career. The romantic hero of the Paris secret marriage was effectively reduced to a royal debtor. In the damp, ink-stained ledgers of the Tudor treasury, we see the true nature of their relationship shift. Brandon was no longer just a friend. He was an investment that Henry intended to milk for every penny. There is a rhyme that has clung to Charles Brandon for 5 centuries, a snippet of verse that defines his audacity. The legend claims that shortly after their return to England, while the court still whispered about his treason and the king's debt collectors were tallying his fines, Brandon appeared at a tournament displaying a banner with a specific quatrain: "Cloth of gold do not despise, though thou be matched with cloth of frieze. Cloth of frieze be not too bold, though thou be matched with cloth of gold." It is a masterclass in political branding. Frieze was a coarse, heavy woolen fabric, the material of the common man. By calling himself Cloth of Frieze, Brandon was publicly owning his lower status to preempt the snobbery of the old nobility. He was telling the Dukes of Norfolk and Buckingham, "I know I am wool and she is gold, but we are woven together." But we must pause and ask, did this actually happen? History keeps its secrets. We have no surviving physical banner, no invoice from an embroiderer, and no contemporary letter from 1515 explicitly quoting it. The rhyme appears in Richard Grafton's Chronicle decades later, leading some historians to suspect it might be apocryphal, a romantic invention to explain the unexplainable rise of a commoner. Yet, even if the specific words were invented later, the sentiment is visually verified in the famous double portrait of the couple painted around this time. In the painting, Mary is depicted with the emblems of royalty, often holding an artichoke or caduceus to signify her status as a queen dowager. Brandon stands beside her, his hand grasping hers. In the visual language of the Renaissance, this hand-holding was a radical statement of equality. The Venetian ambassadors often reported on Brandon's incredible influence, with one noting he was second only to the king. Whether the rhyme was painted on a shield or merely whispered in the damp corridors of Greenwich, it was the reality of his existence. He was the coarse wool stitched to the royal tapestry, and for the rest of his life, he would have to ensure the seam did not tear. If Charles Brandon thought the danger had passed once he stepped off the boat in Dover in May 1515, he was sorely mistaken. He had survived the king's initial rage in France, having bought his life with a crippling financial settlement and Mary's tearful intervention, but returning to the English court was arguably more dangerous than facing Henry alone. It was a return to the snake pit. We must look at the court records to truly understand the temperature of the room. While Henry's greeted the couple with a public show of forgiveness, likely relieved to have his favorite jousting partner back, the council was a different matter. The old nobility, families like the Howards and the Staffords who traced their lineage back for centuries, viewed Brandon not just as a rival, but as a biological insult. To them, he was merely the son of a standard-bearer, a man who had jumped the great chain of being by marrying a consecrated queen. Venetian ambassador Sebastian Justinian provides us with the journalistic reality of the situation. In his dispatches to the Doge, he captures the palpable animosity, reporting that the Duke of Suffolk is not beloved. This is diplomatic speak for absolute hatred. The council minutes from this period are chilly. We see disputes over precedence and petty squabbles over the specific jewels and plate Mary brought back from France. It wasn't just jealousy, it was political survival. If a commoner could marry a princess and live, the rigid hierarchy of feudal England was beginning to crack. Speculating on the psychological atmosphere, one can only imagine the whispers that stopped the moment Brandon and Mary entered the Great Hall. The motto discussed in the previous chapter, "Cloth of gold, do not despise," was likely born in this specific crucible of tension. It wasn't a boast, it was a shield against the icy stares of the aristocracy. Modern historians might suggest that this social isolation ironically drove Brandon closer to the king, as Henry was the only man in England powerful enough to protect him from the wolves in velvet. They were back in England, but for the first time, Charles Brandon was truly alone against the establishment. It is June 1520. We are in the Val d'Or, a valley between Guines and Ardres in northern France, for the most expensive party ever thrown on European soil, the Field of Cloth of Gold. If you think modern diplomatic summits are extravagant, they are nothing compared to the Tudor theater of power. The records tell us that Henry's and Francis I of France brought thousands of courtiers, erecting temporary palaces made not of stone, but of timber, glass, and canvas painted to look like masonry. And right at the center of this golden mirage was Charles Brandon. While the old nobility, like the resentful Duke of Buckingham, grumbled about the ruinous cost of the velvets and silks required to attend, Brandon thrived. This was his element. As the Duke of Suffolk, he was not merely a spectator. He was a primary participant in the justs, the physical avatar of English strength. Venetian ambassadors, usually cynical in their dispatches, were breathless, describing Brandon and the king as twin sons, clad in armor that cost more than a peasant village would earn in a century. But let's strip away the gold leaf for a moment. Sensory history requires us to look past the paintings. The weather in June 1520 was atrocious. A storm actually blew down the French king's marquee, snapping the heavy poles like twigs. Imagine the reality, the smell of thousands of horses mixing with the damp wool of soaking wet tapestries. The ground, despite being covered in woven gold carpets, was turning to French mud beneath the boots of the courtiers. For Brandon, this event was a precarious tightrope walk. He had to outshine the French nobility without outshining Henry, a fatal mistake he was too smart to make. He was there to validate Henry's magnificence. Yet, there is a hollow ring to all this splendor. We know, looking back, that this diplomatic triumph was a failure. Within months, England and France would be enemies again. The Field of Cloth of Gold was arguably Brandon's masterpiece of performance art, a dazzling, shimmering lie that proved he was the only man capable of projecting the king's fantasy into reality, even as the rain washed it away. If the Field of Cloth of Gold was the theater of war, the campaign of 1523 was the cold, biting reality. We have to ask a difficult question here, one that challenges the romantic image of the Tudor knight. Was Charles Brandon actually a competent general, or was he simply a juster who didn't know the difference between a tilt barrier and a trench? Henry's entrusted Brandon with the command of the great enterprise, a massive invasion force aimed at capturing Paris itself. Initially, the optics were magnificent. Brandon marched his troops to within 50 miles of the French capital, striking terror into the Parisians. The chroniclers of the time, painting with a patriotic brush, depicted him as a conquering hero echoing the glory of Agincourt. But if we look closer at the frantic dispatches sent back to Cardinal Wolsey, a different picture emerges, one of logistical nightmares and freezing mud. The primary enemy wasn't the French army, it was the weather and the supply chain. Modern military historians often critique Brandon for lacking the ruthless strategic mind required for extended warfare. Jousting requires bursts of adrenaline and physical coordination. Commanding an army requires patience and the calculated heartlessness to maintain discipline among starving men. Brandon, it seems, had the heart of a courtier, not a warlord. When the winter set in, historically described as one of the bitterest in living memory, and the supplies failed to arrive, the army's morale collapsed. Wolsey, safe in England, failed to send the promised gold to pay the mercenaries. Faced with the very real threat of mutiny, Brandon made the decision to retreat without taking Paris. It was a humiliating end to the campaign. While he wasn't executed for this failure, a testament to the unique immunity he enjoyed as Henry's favorite, the retreat exposed the limits of his abilities. He could unhorse any man in Europe in the controlled environment of the lists, but he could not defeat the logistical realities of the Somme. He was, effectively, a master of the game of war, who found the reality far less sporting. History often paints Charles Brandon simply as the king's best friend, the jovial companion for late-night revelries and jousting tournaments. But if we look closer at the behavioral patterns, a more complex, almost pathological dynamic emerges. Psychologically speaking, Brandon may have functioned as something more complex than a mere companion, perhaps as Henry's alter ego, a living extension of the king's idealized self. This theory, while speculative, helps explain the otherwise inexplicable. Why Henry forgave treasons that would have sent other men to the block. In the claustrophobic world of the Tudor court, Henry was the son, bound by rigid protocol, the safety of the succession, and the crushing weight of divine expectation. Brandon, however, was the heat without the responsibility. Consider the physical evidence scattered through the archives. Contemporaries often remarked on their striking resemblance. Both men were tall, athletic, and possessed of a similar reddish-gold vitality. We see in the Great Wardrobe accounts that Henry frequently gifted Brandon his own clothes, effectively dressing a living mannequin in his own image. When Brandon rode out to joust or led armies into the mud of France, he was performing the physical feats Henry fantasized about but was often too valuable, or later too physically compromised, to risk. This theory of vicarious living helps explain the otherwise inexplicable. Why did Henry forgive Brandon for the treasonous marriage to Mary Tudor? Why did he survive failures that cost other men their heads? If we accept the alter ego theory, then punishing Brandon would have been an act of psychological self-mutilation for the king. As the Venetian ambassadors noted with a mix of awe and confusion, Brandon acted with an authority that dangerously mirrored the king's own, yet he was never struck down for it. Modern psychology might classify this as a narcissistic extension. Henry could enjoy Brandon's triumphs as his own, yet distance himself from Brandon's failures, like the logistical nightmare of the 1523 campaign discussed in the previous chapter, without suffering the direct blow to his royal ego. Brandon, whether by brilliant calculation or sheer instinct, allowed himself to be the vessel for Henry's uninhibited self. He was the king unchained. But this protection came at a terrifying cost. To be the king's shadow meant Brandon had to suppress his own identity, forever dancing to the tune of a man who saw him not as a separate soul, but as a mirror reflecting his own glory. By 1529, the air in London was thick with something heavier than the summer heat. It was the suffocating weight of the great matter. We arrive now at a pivotal juncture in Charles Brandon's life, a moment where the jovial Juste had to die so the political survivor could live. For years, Brandon had walked a tightrope. His wife, Mary Tudor, was a staunch ally of Catherine of Aragon. They were sisters-in-law and close friends. To support the king's annulment was to betray his wife's heart, but to oppose Henry was to court death. The tension culminated in the stifling hall of the Blackfriars Court. The primary sources, specifically the accounts of George Cavendish, Cardinal Wolsey's own gentleman usher, paint a scene of unbearable frustration. The papal legate, Cardinal Campeggio, was stalling, using every procedural delay in the canon law book to avoid granting Henry his divorce. The king was trapped in a legal labyrinth of Rome's making. It was here that Brandon abandoned neutrality. According to the eyewitness accounts, as the cardinals announced yet another adjournment, the Duke of Suffolk slammed his hand onto the table with a violence that silenced the room. He looked at the clergyman and shouted the famous line, "It was never merry in England whilst we had cardinals among us." We must pause to analyze the weight of this outburst. Was it genuine anger? Or was it, as we discussed in the previous chapter, a calculated performance by the king's alter ego? Henry could not scream at the Pope's representatives without causing an international incident. But Brandon? Brandon could be the hammer. This moment signaled the end of Cardinal Wolsey's era and the beginning of the Reformation. By publicly attacking the churchmen, Brandon signaled that his loyalty to Henry superseded his faith, his wife's friendships, and the old feudal order. He had made his choice, effectively severing his ties to the past to ensure his future in Henry's new world, no matter the domestic cost that awaited him back home. If the trial at Blackfriars was the public explosion of the old religious order, the aftershocks devastated the Brandon household. We must remember that Mary Tudor was not merely Charles's wife. She was the Dowager Queen of France and a born Tudor princess. Her loyalty to Catherine of Aragon was absolute, rooted in years of friendship and shared royal dignity. When Charles sided with Henry's great matter, slamming his hand on the table at Blackfriars, he was not just defying the Pope. He was defying the woman who had risked treason to marry him. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador whose dispatches provide our sharpest lens into this period, reported a scene of domestic volatility that shatters the romantic image of this cloth of gold couple. In 1532, as Henry prepared to take Anne Boleyn to Calais for a diplomatic summit, he demanded Mary's presence to legitimize Anne's status. Mary refused. Chapuis gleefully noted that this refusal led to a violent quarrel between the Duke and the French Queen. He insinuated that Brandon used injurious words against his royal wife, a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable a decade prior. We have to ask, was this anger genuine, or was Brandon performing for an audience of spies to protect his family from the king's wrath? The records go silent on their private conversations, but the geography speaks volumes. Mary increasingly withdrew to Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk, distancing herself from the court which she now viewed as morally bankrupt. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as anything other than the concubine. For Brandon, this was a political nightmare. His power relied entirely on Henry's favor, yet his wife was the figurehead of the opposition. We might speculate that this stress catalyzed her declining health. Modern medicine tells us that chronic cortisol exposure can ravage the immune system. While Mary sat in the country, Brandon was forced to navigate the treacherous currents of the Reformation alone. It is a tragic irony that the man who once risked execution to marry for love was now forced to choose power over his wife's conscience. By the time the Calais trip occurred, the emotional partnership of Charles and Mary had effectively dissolved, leaving them on opposite sides of history's most famous divorce. If history is written by the victors, the silence of the survivors is often just as telling. In the archives of the 1530s, as the Great Matter tore England apart, we find a deafening silence regarding Charles Brandon's private conscience. We have ample evidence of Mary Tudor's position. The French queen was vocal, obstinate, and dangerous in her loyalty to Catherine of Aragon. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn, famously referring to her only as that woman. But what of Charles? We must ask the uncomfortable question: did Brandon truly believe that Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid, or was he simply a man who knew the price of dissent? The primary sources offer us a void. There are no surviving letters where Charles pours out his heart to a confidant, questioning the king's theology. However, this absence of evidence is likely evidence of fear. In the court of Henry's, ink on parchment was often the first step toward the scaffold. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, provides us with our only glimpse into this duality. He reported that while Brandon publicly executed the king's will, bullying the clergy and banging tables at Blackfriars, privately he seemed cool toward the Boleyn faction. Chapuis hinted that Brandon might have been sympathetic to Catherine, yet this remains in the realm of diplomatic whisper. We can speculate that Brandon's silence was a survival mechanism. Unlike Mary, whose Tudor blood made her untouchable, Charles was entirely a creation of the king. To disagree with Henry was to unmake himself. Thus, Westhorpe Hall became a house truly divided: Mary, safe in her royal indignation, and Charles, trapped in a silent, terrifying obedience. He likely did not agree with the divorce, but he agreed with survival. As the records go dark on his personal feelings, we see the tragedy of the courtier. He could be the husband of a queen or the friend of a king, but the politics of the Reformation ensured he could no longer be both. June 1533. The air at Westhorpe Hall was heavy, not just with the humidity of an English summer, but with the palpable silence of an ending. Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France and the Duchess of Suffolk, was fading. We have a primary source from this final period, a letter Mary wrote to her brother, Henry's, which makes for heartbreaking reading. In it, she describes herself as having been very sick and ill at ease for some time. The vibrant, rebellious princess who had once danced in the French court was now confined to her chambers, her body failing her. When she finally passed away on the morning of June 25th, the tether that had long secured Charles Brandon's safety in the Tudor court snapped. But the immediate aftermath offers us a fascinating, if somewhat cold, glimpse into Henry's psyche. The king ordered a magnificent funeral for his sister at the Abbey of Berry Street, Edmonds. The herald's records detail a procession of immense grandeur, black velvet, French heraldry, and a requiem mass that echoed with the full weight of the Catholic faith Henry was in the process of dismantling. Yet, amidst the pomp, there was a glaring absence: the king himself. Henry's did not attend, but history offers us two theories, and we must weigh them carefully. The charitable interpretation is Henry's well-documented hypochondria. He possessed a pathological fear of sickness and death, often fleeing London at the first whisper of plague. To be near a corpse, even a royal one, was to face his own mortality. However, the darker theory, supported by the dispatches of the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, suggests this was political. Mary had been a vocal supporter of Catherine of Aragon and had refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen. Was Henry's absence a final petty punishment for her defiance? We will never know for certain, but the silence speaks volumes. For Charles Brandon, the grief must have been compounded by a terrifying realization. He stood by the grave not just as a grieving husband, but as a man who had lost his greatest shield. He was no longer the king's brother-in-law, merely his old friend. And in the court of Henry's, friendship was a notoriously perishable commodity. When Mary Tudor, the Dowager Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk, finally closed her eyes in June 1533, the official record spoke of a long, lingering decline. But if we strip away the Tudor euphemisms and apply a modern diagnostic lens to the primary sources, a complex medical mystery emerges. For years, Mary had been absent from the vibrant center of the court, her letters to her brother, Henry's, frequently citing a debilitating pain in my side, and a general malaise that left the once vibrant Tudor Rose pale and exhausted. Historians have long debated the true nature of this wasting sickness. The prevailing theory has often been tuberculosis, the relentless consumption that stalked the damp corridors of English palaces. The symptoms fit the slow weight loss, the pallor, the fatigue. However, the specific and recurring mention of severe pain in her side suggests a darker physiological culprit, perhaps a malignancy or a large tumor that 16th century physicians had neither the language to diagnose nor the tools to treat. We must also consider the theory of chronic angina, given the high-stress environment of her final years. But we cannot separate the physical body from the political spirit. Modern medicine acknowledges the lethal impact of chronic stress, and Mary's final years were a crucible of anxiety. She was forced to watch her brother dismantle the church she loved to marry and Boleyn, a woman Mary reportedly referred to as the concubine. Worse, her husband, Charles Brandon, was the king's enforcer in this new regime. While Mary sat in self-imposed exile at Westhorpe Hall, clinging to the old ways, Brandon was at court, banging tables and threatening clergy to secure the divorce. The psychological toll of this rift, loving the husband while hating his mission, likely accelerated her decline. In the end, whether it was a carcinogen or a broken heart that stopped her pulse, her death removed the last protective shield standing between Charles Brandon and the volatile whims of the king. If the marriage to Mary Tudor was the romance of the century, Charles Brandon's next move was the scandal of the decade. Mere weeks after burying the French queen, the woman he had once risked his head to marry, the Duke of Suffolk stood at the altar again. The date was September 1533. The bride was Catherine Willoughby, the Baroness Willoughby de Resby in her own right. She was wealthy, titled, and undoubtedly a prize of the court. She was also 14 years old. But the true shock, the detail that makes the modern reader recoil, is that until that very moment, Catherine had been betrothed to Brandon's own 10-year-old son, Henry, Earl of Lincoln. To understand this, we must strip away modern morality and look through the cold, hard lens of Tudor wardship laws. In the 16th century, wealthy orphans were commodities. Brandon had purchased the wardship of Catherine years earlier, effectively buying the right to control her fortune and her marriage. Originally, the plan was dynastic. Marry her to his son to secure the Willoughby lands for future generations. But with Mary Tudor dead, the financial safety net of the French pension was gone. Brandon was heavily in debt to the king, a lingering consequence of the fines levied for his secret marriage to Mary years prior. Waiting for his son to come of age was a luxury he could no longer afford. Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, always keen to highlight the moral failings of the English court, noted with cynical amusement that the Duke had simply swapped the bridegroom to access the inheritance immediately. In a dispatch, Chapuis reported that the marriage was purely for saving of expenses. It is a stark reminder that while Brandon is often romanticized as a dashing hero, he was also a ruthless survivor. He looked at a girl promised to his son and saw a ledger sheet that could save him from ruin. History keeps its secrets regarding how the young Catherine felt about this arrangement, or how Brandon's son reacted to losing his bride to his father, but the records are clear on the result. Brandon secured the fortune, but in doing so, he revealed the terrified pragmatism lurking beneath his golden facade. If the death of Mary Tudor was a tragedy, the event that followed was nothing short of a scandal that would make even the most hardened modern tabloid editor blush. Barely 3 months after burying the king's sister, the woman for whom he had once risked his head, Charles Brandon did the unthinkable. On September 7, 1533, the nearly 50-year-old Duke married Catherine Willoughby. The bride was Catherine Willoughby, the Baroness Willoughby de Resby in her own right. She was wealthy, titled, and undoubtedly a prize of the court. She was also approximately 13 or 14 years old. The exact date of her birth remains uncertain, though most historians place it around 1519 or 1520, making her more than 30 years Brandon's junior. But the true shock, the detail that makes the modern reader recoil, is that until that very moment, Catherine had been betrothed to Brandon's own son, Henry, Earl of Lincoln. Why would Brandon commit such a jarring breach of social expectations? We must look to the ledger books, not the heart, for the answer. With Mary's death, the massive income she received from France, her dower as the former French queen, evaporated overnight. Brandon was instantly plunged into a financial abyss, staring down the barrel of the massive debts he still owed Henry for the fines levied back in 1515. The Willoughby inheritance was vast, arguably one of the richest in England, and Brandon realized that marrying her to his sickly son, the Earl of Lincoln, was a risk. If his son died, the fortune might drift away. By marrying the girl himself, he secured the assets directly. Eustace Chapuis, the ever-cynical imperial ambassador, reported on this development with his usual dryness, noting that the Duke had married the girl to repair his affairs. It is a cold phrase, repair his affairs, stripping away any pretense of romance. In the eyes of the court, this was a desperate liquidation of assets in the form of a marriage contract. Yet, we must ask, was this purely predatory, or was it the survival instinct of a man who knew his position at court depended entirely on his ability to project wealth? While history often paints this as a grotesque mismatch, the records suggest a surprising partnership eventually formed. But in 1533, as Brandon stood at the altar with his son's fiancée, he wasn't looking at a bride. He was looking at a lifeline that would keep the wolves and the king's debt collectors from his door. If Charles Brandon had a theology, it was likely engraved on the back of a coin rather than in the pages of a Bible. Throughout the 1520s, he had been a stalwart of the old faith, engaging in the traditional piety of the medieval aristocracy and even opposing Anne Boleyn, the champion of reform, largely because he despised her influence over the king. Yet, as we move into the late 1530s, we witness a transformation that historians still debate. Was this a genuine spiritual awakening, or the most dangerous performance of his life? The catalyst appears to be twofold: the king's break with Rome and Brandon's new, young wife, Catherine Willoughby. We must remember that in Henry's court, religion was not a private matter. It was a test of loyalty. To remain visibly Catholic when the king was dismantling the monasteries was to flirt with treason. Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, usually sharp in his character assessments, seemed frequently baffled by Brandon during this period, describing him essentially as a weather vane turning with the king's breath. The records show that as the dissolution of the monasteries commenced, Brandon was not merely a passive observer, he was a primary beneficiary. He ruthlessly suppressed monastic houses in Lincolnshire, absorbing their estates to patch the holes in his own finances. It is easy, therefore, to view his slide toward Protestantism as purely mercenary, a conversion bought with the lead from abbey roofs and the stone of desecrated altars. However, we must apply a what if to this cynicism. What if the influence of Catherine Willoughby was more profound than we give her credit for? Despite her youth, Catherine became a fervent, outspoken reformer, eventually risking her own life for the Protestant cause after Brandon's death. Correspondence from the era suggests she held significant sway over the Duke's household. It is plausible that the aging warrior, weary of the political complexities of Rome, found a simpler, perhaps more convenient truth in his wife's radical books. Yet, the silence of his private conscience remains deafening. In the end, Brandon likely realized that to survive Henry's, one had to be a mirror. If the king was the supreme head of the church, then Brandon would be his most devout disciple, regardless of what prayers he whispered in the dark. In late 1536, the abstract theological debates we discussed in the previous chapter solidified into a terrifying reality: 40,000 armed men marching across the north of England. This was the pilgrimage of grace, the greatest threat Henry's ever faced from his own people. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was sent to Lincolnshire not as a diplomat, but as the king's hammer. However, the primary sources from this campaign reveal a man deeply conflicted, hesitating on the precipice of civil war. Brandon's dispatches to the king during this period are fascinatingly cautious. Facing an army that vastly outnumbered his own retinue, Brandon wrote letters expressing a distinct reluctance to engage in open battle. While Henry sat in Windsor screaming for blood and demanding the rebels be crushed without mercy, Brandon was on the muddy ground, seeing the faces of countrymen who bore the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. We must ask, was this hesitation born of military prudence, or a crisis of conscience? Brandon was a man of the old nobility. Deep down, his sympathies likely aligned more with the conservative rebels than with Thomas Cromwell's radical reforms. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, reported with grim satisfaction that the king's own commanders were wavering. Chapuis hinted that if a man of Brandon's stature had chosen this moment to defect, the Tudor dynasty would have collapsed within a week. It is a staggering what-if scenario. The king's oldest friend held the power to unmake him. Instead, Brandon chose loyalty over conscience. He utilized negotiation and deceit rather than cannon fire, promising the rebels pardons he knew the king would never honor. The records go silent on his private feelings, but speak of a grim pragmatism. He disbanded the rebel army without a major battle, saving the king's throne but damning his own soul to be the instrument of the betrayals that followed. As the rebels dispersed, believing in the king's mercy, Brandon knew the time for negotiation was ending and the time for the executioner was about to begin. The winter of 1537 brought a chilling transformation to the character of Charles Brandon. The banners of the Pilgrimage of Grace had been furled, not by the lance, but by broken promises. Now, the king demanded payment in blood. We see here the emergence of Brandon as the enforcer, a role that required him to strip away the chivalric veneer of the juster and don the grim mask of the executioner. The primary sources from this period are difficult to read, not because of their handwriting, but because of their content. Henry's instructions to Brandon were explicit and terrifyingly vague. He was to cause the dread of justice to remain in the hearts of the rebels. Historically, we often view Brandon as the charming diplomat, but here he navigated a landscape of scaffolds. In Lincolnshire, he presided over the trials of men he likely respected as fellow soldiers. The records show a terrifying efficiency. There were no grand speeches of mercy recorded in the state papers, only lists of names and the logistics of retribution. Ambassador Chapuis, ever the cynical observer, noted the atmosphere of terror that permeated the court, suggesting that even the king's closest friends were acting out of a primal fear for their own survival. This leads us to a disturbing psychological question. How did Brandon reconcile the execution of monks and commoners with his own conscience? Modern psychology might call this compartmentalization. To survive the gravitational pull of Henry's tyranny, Brandon had to separate the man he was in private from the instrument of state he became in public. There is a darker theory, however. Some historians whisper that Brandon wasn't merely obeying orders, that the fear of losing his own head, a very real possibility given his proximity to the throne, turned him ruthless. He became a mirror of the king's wrath because the alternative was to become its victim. The damp chill of the execution grounds in that terrible year marked the death of the Golden Duke and the birth of a survivor who would do anything, absolutely anything, to stay in the king's shadow rather than his crosshairs. The date is May 15, 1536. The setting is the King's Hall within the Tower of London, a space usually reserved for festivities, now hastily converted into a theater of judgment. Here, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, took his seat among the 26 peers of the realm commissioned to try Queen and Boleyn. If we look closely at the seating arrangements and the hierarchy of the court, Brandon was a senior figure, a pillar of the old nobility that had so often antagonized. For years, the hostility between the Boleyn faction and the Brandons had been the worst-kept secret in England, and had insulted Brandon's wife, Mary Tudor, and Brandon had, in turn, often absented himself from court to avoid bowing to the woman he considered a usurper. Now, the tables had turned with brutal efficiency. We must turn to the dispatches of the imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, to gauge Brandon's demeanor during these proceedings. Chapuis, who had acted as a spy and confidant for the opposing Aragonese's faction, reported with a grim sort of glee that the Duke of Suffolk was not merely a passive participant. While other peers might have sat in terrified silence, fearing that a wrong look could implicate them in the Queen's alleged crimes, Brandon appeared composed, perhaps even vindicated. There is a chilling theory here, that for Brandon, this trial was not a tragedy, but a correction of the natural order, a delayed act of justice for the insults leveled against his late wife. The records indicate that the verdict was unanimous. Each peer, starting from the junior-most baron and ascending to the dukes, had to answer guilty or not guilty to the charges of adultery and treason. When it was Brandon's turn, the silence in the hall must have been deafening. He delivered his vote against the Queen without hesitation. In doing so, he solidified his position as the king's most loyal instrument. Yet, we must ask, as he looked at the woman he had once danced with in the mask of a courtier, did he see a traitor, or did he simply see a political obstacle that needed to be removed to keep his own head on his shoulders? The turning of the axe toward the Queen signaled the end of her life, but for Brandon, it signaled the ultimate survival of the fittest. The records of the trial of Anne Boleyn are stark, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly unanimous. Among the 26 peers who sat in judgment on May 15, 1536, we find the name of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. He voted guilty just like the rest. But history demands we pause here, stepping away from the dry ink of the verdict to look at the man holding the pen. We often view these events through the lens of political necessity, yet we must ask the uncomfortable question: what happens to a man's soul when he condemns a woman he once toasted at banquets? Brandon was not a stranger to Anne Boleyn. He had known her for years. He had danced in the same masks, jousted in honor of her rise, and navigated the complex social web of the Tudor court alongside her. While his late wife, Mary Tudor, had despised and Brandon had ultimately learned to coexist with the Boleyn faction to survive. Now, he was tasked with dismantling it. We have no private diaries from Brandon, no confessional letters written in the dead of night expressing regret. The silence in the archives is deafening. However, we can speculate that this moment marked a definitive psychological shift. This was not the adrenaline of the battlefield or the heat of a joust. This was the cold, calculated destruction of an acquaintance to appease the king. Is it possible that Brandon suffered from a form of survivor's guilt? As he watched the heads of the Boleyn circle fall, men he had known, a queen he had served, he must have been acutely aware of the fragility of his own neck. By condemning, and he was essentially buying another day of life from Henry's. The psychological toll of being the king's enforcer likely contributed to the hardening of his character we see in his later years. The joyous, charismatic jouster of the 1520s was fading, replaced by a grim survivor who understood that in Henry's court, loyalty was a currency that devalued the moment it was spent. Brandon survived, yes, but one has to wonder if the silence of his private conscience was the price he paid for keeping his head. Following the seismic shock of Anne Boleyn's execution, the English court entered a period of eerie, almost unnatural calm. Historians often refer to this as the Seymour interlude, a brief window where the terrifying volatility of Henry's seemed to subside into domestic bliss. For Charles Brandon, the rise of Jane Seymour was not just a political victory, it was a personal relief. We know from the dispatches of Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, that Brandon had long despised Anne Boleyn, often siding with the conservative faction that wished to see the concubine removed. With Jane on the throne, the atmosphere shifted from electric anxiety to traditional, soothing pageantry. Brandon's young wife, Catherine Willoughby, found a kindred spirit in the new queen, and for a moment, the Duke of Suffolk could stop looking over his shoulder. The court records from the summer of 1536 show a return to the hunts and feasts of Brandon's youth, a deliberate attempt to recreate the golden days of the king's early reign. But we must apply a psychological lens here. Was this genuine relaxation, or the hypervigilance of a survivor? Brandon had just helped send a queen to the scaffold. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that Henry's favor was as fluid as water. While he toasted the king's happiness, he was likely calculating his own survival. What if this interlude was actually the most dangerous time of all? It lulled the court into a false sense of security. The conservative faction believed they had won and restored the king to sanity. Jane Seymour worked tirelessly to reconcile Henry with his eldest daughter, Mary, a cause Brandon supported, but the price was Mary's total submission to the king's religious supremacy. Brandon, the ultimate pragmatist, watched as the old world he knew continued to erode, masked by the pleasantries of a new marriage. It was the summer of the king's contentment, but as we look at the timeline, we know it was merely the deep breath before the final, tragic plunge. The stability was an illusion. The axe was merely resting. By 1540, Charles Brandon was no longer the dashing jouster of the field of cloth of gold. He was an aging statesman navigating a court that had become a slaughterhouse. The Cleves fiasco represents perhaps the most delicate tightrope walk of his entire career. Thomas Cromwell had orchestrated the king's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves to secure a Protestant alliance, but when Henry met his new bride, the reaction was catastrophic. We must look at the primary sources, specifically the depositions taken later, where Henry famously lamented, "I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse." Brandon, ever the king's mirror, stood right beside him during this diplomatic implosion. When it became clear the marriage would not stand, the legal machinery of annulment began to turn. The grounds were non-consummation. Here, the records offer a clinical, yet deeply uncomfortable insight into the Duke's role. Brandon was required to testify regarding the king's private complaints. According to the official depositions, Brandon confirmed that the king had confided in him the morning after the wedding, stating that he had found himself unable to perform his husbandly duties due to a lack of attraction. In a modern context, this seems merely embarrassing. In the 16th century, admitting the king's physical failure was dancing on the edge of treason. We have to ask, what was going through Brandon's mind as he placed these intimate failures on the public record? He was effectively confirming the king's humiliation to save the king's dynasty. While Ambassador Marillac reported with glee on the chaos in the English court, Brandon remained stoic. He helped dismantle the work of his political rival, Cromwell, by validating the king's version of events. If Brandon had hesitated, or if he had tried to save the alliance, he likely would have shared Cromwell's fate on Tower Hill. Instead, he proved once again that his loyalty was not to policy, religion, or honor, but solely to the person of Henry's. He absorbed the king's shame so that Henry could cast aside the Flanders mare and move on to the next tragedy. By the winter of 1541, Charles Brandon was no longer the dashing juster who had dazzled the field of cloth of gold. He was an aging statesman, his joints likely stiffening from arthritis, the long-term cost of his chivalric career, and his patience wearing thin. Yet, Henry's required him to perform one final, grim duty involving the rose without a thorn, Queen Catherine Howard. While popular history often focuses on the hysteria of the young queen, the Privy Council records reveal the cold, bureaucratic machine that dismantled her, with Charles Brandon at the controls. When the revelations of Catherine's premarital life were brought to the king by Archbishop Cranmer, Henry refused to believe them, ordering a secret investigation to prove her innocence. Instead, the evidence proved her guilt. Brandon, as Lord President of the Council, was tasked with the unglamorous work of extraction. We see him in the primary sources, specifically the dispatches to the king, methodically interrogating the terrified household. It was Brandon who was sent to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's house to break open her coffers and seize the papers that would condemn the queen. There is a profound, almost cruel irony here. In his youth, Brandon had navigated a labyrinth of secret contracts, annulments, and clandestine marriages. The very loose marital history Catherine was now being destroyed for. Did he see a reflection of his own youthful indiscretions in the sobbing girl? The records offer no sentimentality. The council minutes show Brandon as efficient and relentless. Ambassador Chapuis reported on the somber atmosphere, noting that while the king wept openly, his counselors, including Suffolk, moved with surgical precision to sever the limb to save the body politic. We must ask, was this merely obedience, or was Brandon protecting Henry from his own heartbreak? By taking charge of the investigation, Brandon allowed Henry to remain the grieving victim rather than the executioner. The psychological burden of condemning a woman 30 years his junior must have weighed on him, but in the Tudor court, survival often meant burying your conscience alongside your enemies. This was the final tragedy not just for Catherine, but for the illusion of Henry's second youth. By the early 1540s, Charles Brandon was a living relic, one of the solitary survivors of the golden circle that had surrounded Henry's at his coronation. But while court portraiture from this era presents us with a dignified, bearded statesman draped in fur, modern medical analysis suggests a much more painful reality beneath the velvet. We must remember that for nearly 4 decades, Brandon had subjected his body to the extreme physics of the joust. This was not merely sport, it was controlled vehicular collision. If we apply contemporary sports medicine to the historical record, we can reasonably speculate about significant orthopedic degradation. Modern doctors examining the lifestyle of a Tudor jouster would expect chronic pain from repeated impacts, the kind of injuries that, in our era, we associate with professional athletes who suffer concussions and joint damage over long careers. While we have no medical records diagnosing Brandon specifically, the physical toll of his profession would have been immense. Brandon realized that the only thing standing between Mary and a second, miserable political marriage was his own willingness to commit treason. Consider the mechanics. A lance strike to the cuirass delivers a kinetic shockwave that travels instantly through the skeletal structure. Even if the rider stays in the saddle, the neck snaps back, a whiplash event repeated hundreds of times over a career. Modern pathologists reviewing the lifestyle of a Tudor jouster would expect to find fused vertebrae, osteoarthritis in the hips and knees from the immense weight of plate armor, and perhaps the early symptoms of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Historians often overlook the role of chronic pain in the temperament of historical figures. When we analyze Brandon's actions in the 1540s, his efficiency, his lack of sentimentality, and his grim adherence to duty, we might ask a speculative question. Was this the wisdom of age, or the hardening of a man living in constant, grinding agony? Unlike the king, whose physical decline was documented in grotesque detail by royal physicians and gossiping ambassadors like Chapuis, Brandon's ailments remain a silence in the archives. He refused to show weakness. In a court where illness was a political liability, Brandon's ability to mask his physical ruin was perhaps his greatest deception. As we approach his final military command, we are not watching a healthy general, but a broken gladiator fueled by adrenaline and a lifelong refusal to yield. In 1544, we witness a historical spectacle that borders on the surreal. 2 elderly men, physical wreckages of their former athletic selves, deciding to invade France one last time. Henry's, now swollen and often carried in a litter, and Charles Brandon, likely riddled with arthritis and the cumulative trauma of 1,000 justs, donned full plate armor to chase a ghost of their youth. This was the Boulogne campaign, and for Brandon, it was the ultimate triumph of will over biology. Modern orthopedics tells us that the cold, damp conditions of a prolonged siege are the worst possible environment for a man with Brandon's history of skeletal trauma. Yet, the records show him commanding with a vigor that defied his age. Serving as the lieutenant general of the king's army, Brandon wasn't just a figurehead, he was in the mud. While Henry's observed from a safe distance, obsessed with his artillery and the thunder of the cannons, Brandon was executing the tactical grind of the siege. We must ask, was this merely duty, or was the battlefield the only place left where Charles Brandon felt truly alive? Perhaps the adrenaline of war was the only effective painkiller he had left. Primary sources, specifically the dispatches sent back to the council, paint a picture of a grim, muddy slog rather than a chivalric romance. The High Marshal had to manage supply lines, disease in the camp, and the king's fluctuating temperament. When the lower town of Boulogne finally fell, it was Brandon who secured the victory, allowing Henry to ride in for the glory. It was a piece of political theater perfectly executed. But beneath the steel breastplate, the physical cost must have been excruciating. This campaign was a final, defiant roar against the dying of the light, a last hurrah that cemented his status as the king's indispensable right hand, even as his own body was quietly failing him. If we look at the contemporary propaganda, specifically the famous Caudray engravings commissioned to immortalize the Siege of Boulogne, war looks geometric, orderly, and glorious. The lines of tents are pristine. The cannons are arranged with mathematical precision. But if we dig beneath the oil paint and look at the state papers and treasury accounts from the autumn of 1544, the sensory reality of Charles Brandon's final campaign shifts from a pageant to a nightmare. By this point, Brandon was a relic of a bygone era, an old knight in a modern war of attrition. The primary sources describe a season of relentless rain, turning the encampments around Boulogne into a swamp of viscous, freezing mud. We must apply a modern medical lens here. For a man in his 60s, likely suffering from the accumulated arthritis of a lifetime of jousting trauma, living in a damp, unheated tent would have been physically excruciating. While the court paintings show him commanding with vigor, his body was likely screaming in protest with every shift in the weather. However, the physical toll paled in comparison to the financial catastrophe. The conquest of Boulogne cost Henry's an estimated nearly £1 million, an astronomical sum that effectively bankrupted the crown. To pay for this glory, Henry was forced to initiate the great debasement of the coinage, mixing copper into the silver, literally devaluing the wealth of his subjects to fund his ego. Brandon, serving as the king's lieutenant, was the man on the ground managing this hemorrhage of resources. The dispatches sent back to the Privy Council reveal the strain: shortages of bread, the spread of dysentery, the bloody flux, and the desperate need for munitions. There is a profound irony in this chapter of Brandon's life. He secured the victory Henry demanded, proving his loyalty one last time, but the prize was a bombed-out city that England could not afford to keep. The heralds cried victory, but the ledgers whispered ruin. It was a triumph of will over reality, much like the relationship between the Duke and the King itself. There is perhaps no historical document more intimate or more performative than a Tudor will. As we move from the mud of Boulogne to the quiet chambers of Guildford in August 1545, we find Charles Brandon dictating his final legacy. If you hold the transcripts of his last will and testament, the first thing that strikes you is a request that was blatantly ignored. Brandon explicitly asked for a modest burial at the Collegiate Church of Tattershall in Lincolnshire, surrounded by his own people. Yet, as we know, Henry's would overrule this dying wish, ordering Brandon to be interred at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. Even in death, Brandon was not allowed to leave the king's side. He belonged to the crown more than he belonged to himself. But look closely at the bequests. Who did the Duke trust with the crumbling empire of his estate? The records show a profound reliance on his young wife, Catherine Willoughby. He named her the executrix, placing the future of his two young sons, Henry and Charles, entirely in her hands. This was not merely a romantic gesture, it was a strategic legal maneuver. Brandon knew the vultures were circling. The debts we discussed in the previous chapters, the lingering financial ruin from the French campaigns, and the cost of maintaining a ducal lifestyle were massive. By empowering Catherine, a woman of sharp intellect and reformist zeal, he was building a firewall around his heirs. However, the silence in the will is just as loud as the words. There are scant provisions for his older children from previous complications, and the shadow of the king's treasury looms over every line. We must ask, was this will an act of hope or an act of damage control? The specific language regarding his debts to the king suggests he died knowing he was leaving his family in a precarious position. He was betting on Henry's mercy, a gamble that, historically, rarely paid off. In my interpretation, this document reveals a man tired of the game, trying desperately to settle the blood debt with ink before his heart stopped beating. On the afternoon of August 22, 1545, at Guildford, the heavy breathing of the Duke of Suffolk finally stopped. It was a Saturday, and the summer heat would have been oppressive, hanging thick over the Surrey countryside. Just days prior, Brandon had been sitting in council meetings, actively planning the defense of the realm against the French. The suddenness of his departure is what strikes the modern historian most forcibly. There was no lingering, wasting sickness like the one that claimed Mary Tudor. One moment the Titan was there, a pillar of the state, and the next, he was gone. We have to ask, what actually killed Charles Brandon? The primary sources are frustratingly vague, recording simply that he died. However, if we apply modern medical understanding to the life he led, a clearer, perhaps darker picture emerges. Brandon was approximately 61 years old, an impressive age for a Tudor, certainly, but he had lived the physical life of 10 men. Decades of competitive jousting would have subjected him to repeated concussive trauma, the kind we now associate with CTE in professional athletes. His body was a map of old fractures and deep bruising from the tilt yard. Furthermore, we must consider the diet of a duke: rich meats, heavy wines, and a distinct lack of vegetables. It is highly probable that Brandon suffered from hypertension or atherosclerosis. The speed of his death, active 1 week, dead the next, strongly suggests a catastrophic cardiovascular event, likely a massive heart attack or a stroke. While Henry's was rotting away by inches, his leg ulcerated and his frame immobile, Brandon's end was swift. In a way, it was the final mercy for a man who defined himself by his physicality. He was spared the humiliation of total invalidism. Yet, the timing poses a final, paradoxical question. Did the stress of his financial ruin and the relentless pressure to please a volatile king finally burst the vessel? As the sun set over Guildford that August evening, the last man who truly knew Henry's was gone, leaving the king alone in a court of strangers. For a man who had sent 2 wives, a cardinal, and countless ministers to the scaffold without a visible shudder, the death of Charles Brandon produced a rare crack in Henry's armor. When the news reached the court in late August 1545, the reaction was not the usual scramble for power that accompanied a duke's demise, but a profound, resonant silence. The primary sources offer us a startling deviation from Henry's standard operating procedure. Rather than seizing the duke's property to pay off outstanding debts, of which Brandon had many, the king ordered a funeral of immense grandeur at his own personal expense. We must look at the royal accounts to understand the magnitude of this gesture. Henry's, in his final years, was often financially ruthless, yet he commanded that Brandon be interred not in a local parish in Suffolk, but in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the resting place of kings. This was the ultimate elevation. By placing Brandon near where he himself intended to rest, Henry was acknowledging a bond that transcended the hierarchy of the court. Imperial Ambassador François van der Delft noted the mood of the court, reporting on the heavy atmosphere that hung over the king. It invites a psychological speculation. Was Henry grieving for Brandon, or was he grieving for himself? Modern psychologists might suggest that Brandon served as an external anchor for Henry's identity. They had been the brotherhood of the tilt, 2 golden youths who dominated the European imagination. As Henry grew infirm, struggling with the mobility issues caused by his ulcerated legs, Brandon had remained the active, fighting alter ego. When Brandon's heart finally gave out, the mirror shattered. The king was forced to confront his own mortality without the comforting presence of the one man who remembered him not as a tyrant, but as a boy. The Requiem Mass at Windsor was solemn, filled with the sensory weight of black velvet and burning wax, but the true cost was not in the gold spent, but in the isolation of the monarch left behind. As the stone slab sealed Brandon's vault, Henry's was truly alone for the first time in his life. If history teaches us anything, it is that power is terrifyingly fragile. Charles Brandon spent decades dodging the executioner's axe, surviving the unpredictable rage of Henry's and the muddy trenches of France. He was the ultimate survivor. Yet his legacy would be undone not by a king, nor by a cannonball, but by a microscopic killer that science still struggles to identify. We call it the tragic epilogue of the Brandon line. 6 years after Charles Brandon was laid to rest, a terrifying shadow swept across England in July 1551, the Sudor Angelicus, or the sweating sickness. Unlike the plague, which often targeted the malnourished poor, the sweat had a peculiar appetite for the young, wealthy aristocracy, leading some contemporaries to call it the stopgallant. Modern epidemiologists and pathologists have spent decades trying to diagnose this ghost from the past. Was it a hantavirus carried by rodents? An unknown strain of influenza? Or perhaps pulmonary anthrax? We will likely never know for certain. What the primary sources do tell us is that the onset was sudden, a sense of impending doom, followed by a violent fever and often death within 24 hours. Brandon's 2 teenage sons, Henry and Charles, were the heirs to his hard-won dukedom. When the sickness appeared near them, they were rushed to the countryside in a desperate bid to outrun the contagion. It was futile. The history books record a scene of almost Greek tragedy. Henry, the elder, succumbed first. For approximately 1 hour, the title of Duke of Suffolk passed to his younger brother, Charles. Then the sickness claimed him too. They died in the same bed, ending the direct male line of Charles Brandon in a single afternoon. There is a profound irony here. Charles Brandon had manipulated laws, defied monarchs, and married royalty to secure his house. Yet, nature dismantled his dynasty with ruthless efficiency. The vast estates and the prestigious title were suddenly ownerless, leaving their mother, Catherine Willoughby, to mourn the total collapse of her future. It serves as a grim reminder that while men like Brandon could conquer the court, they were ultimately powerless against the biology of their own mortality. It is a terrifying historical reality, 50 years of political maneuvering, surviving the lethal moods of Henry's, leading armies across the Channel, and marrying a dowager queen, all to have the tangible legacy wiped out in a single afternoon. When Henry and Charles Brandon, the teenage heirs, succumbed to the sweating sickness in July 1551, the direct male line of the first Duke of Suffolk snapped. The collapse was total. Legally, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The Dukedom of Suffolk, a title Charles had worn like armor, became extinct upon the death of the younger boy, Charles, who held the title for perhaps only an hour after his brother Henry expired. The vast estates and the prestige Charles had clawed together were suddenly without a master. It highlights a recurring theme in our study of the Tudors, the terrifying fragility of power in an age before antibiotics. We often view court intrigue, the headsman's axe, or battlefield glory as the defining metrics of success. Yet, here, it wasn't a political rival or a vengeful king that destroyed the House of Brandon, it was biology. The title did not vanish forever, but its transfer marked the end of Charles's specific dream. The dignity was eventually bestowed upon Henry Grey, the husband of Charles's daughter, Frances Brandon. This transfer of power would eventually lead to the tragic rise and fall of Lady Jane Grey, Charles's granddaughter. But for Charles Brandon himself, the man who had been the king's other self, The ultimate defeat was one he wasn't alive to see. His bloodline continued through his daughters, weaving into the tapestry of the nobility, but the House of Brandon, as a dominant political entity, was finished. It serves as a grim, almost poetic reminder that in the 16th century, a dynasty was only as strong as the immune system of its heir. The man who defied a king could not defy the microscopic realities of his time. As we close the heavy, leather-bound book on the life of Charles Brandon, we are left with a singular, haunting question. How did he survive? In a court where the slightest misstep meant the block, where queens, cardinals, and chancellors were systematically purged, Brandon died in his own bed, retaining the king's favor to his final breath. The answer, I suspect, lies in the psychological concept of the mirror. Throughout this series, we have examined the primary sources, from the dusty ledger books of the tilting yards to the frantic letters of Cardinal Wolsey. These documents paint Brandon not merely as a courtier, but as Henry's externalized self. In their youth, Brandon was the physical embodiment of the chivalric ideal Henry aspired to, the juster, the lover, the warrior. As time marched on, and the king's body failed him, Brandon remained the only living link to the golden summer of 1509. To destroy Brandon would have been, for Henry, an act of psychological suicide. Even the cynical imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who rarely had a kind word for the English, seemed perplexed by Brandon's Teflon-like ability to survive scandal. When Brandon committed treason by marrying Mary Tudor, he lived. When he failed in the French campaigns, he was forgiven. History keeps its secrets, but we might speculate that Brandon provided Henry with something no one else could: the truth, tempered by absolute loyalty. He was the only man who could reflect Henry's humanity back to him without threatening his divinity. When Brandon died in August 1545, the records show that Henry ordered a magnificent funeral at Windsor Castle at his own personal expense, a rare gesture from a monarch who usually seized assets rather than spent them. In my personal opinion, the death of Charles Brandon was the final psychological blow to the king. The mirror had finally cracked. With his oldest friend gone, Henry was forced to stare into the void of his own mortality, and it is no coincidence that the king himself would follow his alter ego into the grave less than 18 months later. Charles Brandon was not just a survivor, he was the anchor of the Tudor soul.